Do you believe in the concept of, do you believe in the term of high concept idea? What does it mean to you?
Nothing. I've never known what all that shit is. You know,
You know what they
I
say.
go in when I go into the studio, I speak Hungarian and then I walk out. You know, but that doesn't have anything to do with high concept or anything. Right? So
There's another saying that if a writer cannot pitch his own story in 25 words, then something's wrong with the story.
yeah, I think I've never paid attention to that stuff. But part of it is I don't pitch very much. I write the script, you know, because I don't like the whole process of doing that. And I've done it rarely, but I've certainly never done it in like 25 words. These guys, what they do is saying, okay, this is a movie where showgirls meets, you know, Braveheart, right? That's what Mel wanted to do with the Maccabees. You know, no, I'm teasing. But no, I just don't believe it's silly. I don't believe in doing it.
You said you have to do some pitches, very few, but you have to do. What did you learn? What is the most important thing you can advise young screenwriters who has to pitch?
Don't do it.
Write the script, right?
Write the damn script, exactly. But you know what? It's much more honest. Andy has a guy come in and make a pitch, okay? As opposed to a guy who writes him the script and there it is. It's much more honest. He can decide much better if it's in front of him. There it is. As opposed to someone saying, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. It's a much more honest way to go. Write it. Don't be afraid of sitting down on your butt and writing it, as opposed to talking about it. You know, the German word that I hate. I don't like, no, I like the word, but I hate German words. I'm gun shy about German words. This even has a bad sound. It's Sitzfleisch, Sitzfleisch, right? It means the ability to sit on your ass. You know, and most writers can't do that. They have to talk about it, and we're going to do this, and then they get advice on it, and they do all this stuff. Sit there and write it. Now, it may not work, it may, but do that. It's a much more honest way to go.
So do you?
It's funny because Oliver was here 10 days ago,
Right.
and basically his advice was to write, to continue writing. He writes at least 3 or 4 things a year, whether he throws them
Right.
away or makes something out of it, doesn't matter, but get used to the idea of telling that story.
Yes. That's the most important thing, it really is, because you get into the habit of it, you don't think in terms of selling it. You think in terms of, it forces you to think in terms of making it a good story.
So whenever you get the idea, what is the first step? You have something in your mind, you have to write. How do you start?
That's the most difficult thing. It's the first page. It's a blank page. It depends on what people are comfortable with. Some writers are very comfortable with doing outlines, doing character notes. I spend a lot of time before I begin writing thinking about the characters. And that's where my initial thing happens. And sometimes I take notes on the characters. And then I sort of try to see what the characters want to do. I mean that literally, what they want to do. These entities that you've created, they're now created, they're free, they're on top of the table, and they can dance around the table however they want. What you have to be careful of is that they don't fall off the table, that they go too far, and they do something really stupid and go down, right? So you got to keep them on the table. And that's your own aesthetics and your own sensibility to keep them on this table. That comes with years and with practice. I mean, the sensibility, the aesthetics, with a lot of reading, I believe, much more than watching films, a lot of reading. And then you have some kind of index defined in your own sensibility that doesn't let them fall off the table. If they fall off the table, the script is dead, because then they're doing stuff that totally destroys what they should be doing. So I think a lot about that. Sometimes I take notes when that process is done for myself on the characters, not long notes, but I name them then, and I do 3 or 4 paragraphs on what they do. And then when that's pretty well ready in my head, either in my head or on paper, then I'm ready to try to start. And that's the most difficult thing. It's a blank piece of paper. And I have to tell you, you know, that even after 30 years and 17 films, I'm still terrified each time I start. I'm scared shitless. now it's not going to work. You know, crazy shit, you know. But I force myself to start it, and sometimes I throw it away, and sometimes I stop. You know, but if God is good, then I keep writing. You know, and I usually write that with longhand, and I'm a real Luddite. I mean, I'm a dinosaur. Then I go to a manual typewriter, right? And the whole process is saved. I could dictate it to Naomi, you know, and she puts it on the internet, because I had an agent who, when I started doing this, said that reading what you've written on a manual typewriter is like spending a weekend with the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. You know, so it's a real issue. But that's the way I work. And I emphasize that this is right for me, and I've discovered these things are right for me after all these years, but it certainly may not be right for everybody.
Have you ever
I'm not advising young writers to pick up manual typewriters. I'm not doing that, you know.
Is the typewriter you used in Jagged Edge?
Yeah, actually, that's where the idea came from, because I used a manual typewriter. But this is a great Hollywood story. Then they convinced me to send that typewriter down so that they could actually use that same typewriter in the movie. And they did. Remember the big shot with the typewriter in Jagged Edge? But somebody stole it, so I never got it back. You know, luckily, the movie was in, so I could buy another one. But other than that, sorry.
Do you ever run out of ideas? You have some kind of sometimes problem?
Absolutely. You know, months go by sometimes. And I, you know, I'd like to write something, but I know what I have in mind isn't good enough. You know, and
How do you know it?
I feel it. I feel it. I feel that this isn't just right. Then my wife gets pissed off and says, "Well, you haven't written a word in 3 months. How are we gonna? Kids go to Catholic schools. How are we gonna pay for it? For God's sake!" I'm exaggerating. She never does that. But those are the pressures that I feel myself. You know.
You feel
That's how Showgirls was born. You know, in an attempt to finance Catholic education, I wrote Showgirls.
So you feel financially pressed to write something?
What's that?
You feel financially pressed to write something?
Well, of course, I'm divorced. I have 4 kids. You know, 4 kids growing up. They do go to Catholic schools. They like to go to things like dances and all this shit. I can't walk around like my European father and say, "No, you cannot go," right? And so yeah, of course, we all feel pressure.
Okay. Bármiféle kérdés a közönség soraiból, magyarul, angolul. Elsősorban egy fiatalember.
I'm going to ask one just quick before, because one of the things that's most important is, I think you have a great gut for the audience. And the key is that these movies are made for an audience. And how does that judgment come into play when you're creating something? Because I think here, we often, this group or other groups, we often write for ourselves, which is great. And we don't consider ever showing the movie to an audience. And that's great, but I think then you should make home movies.
Right, I agree.
So I think you have an audience out there that you want to communicate with. You've got to get those interesting people to communicate, to have something to say or to entertain or to do something with that group. What's your thought, or how do you, because that's the most difficult thing, clearly.
I agree with that, absolutely.
So how do you judge that?
I think what I do on its most aesthetic level, and probably the most important one, creative one, is that I write these things in this little room on a manual typewriter, and if it works, millions of people will be taken out of their ordinary lives, and for 2 hours, their lives will be frozen, and they can enjoy it, and it'll be taken out of what they normally live in. Life is difficult, and there is a terrific amount of pain, and if I can ease those pains and tensions for 2 hours by something that I've written in my little room that entertains them, or frightens them, or stimulates them, or makes them think about things, then I've really done something that I'm proud of, okay? If you do the kind of movie I don't mean to use negative terms, but if you do the kind of movie that nobody sees, you know, and that you like, who gives a shit? Make home movies. You know, we're supposed to communicate. We're supposed to, that's what we do. That's what I do. And I try to do movies like that. Doesn't always work. You know, and oftentimes it really doesn't work, and it's very painful when it doesn't. But in many cases it does work, and if you count the numbers of millions of people who for those few hours, you know, have taken some pleasure, where their lives have somehow been improved for that brief period of time by something that you've done in this little room, man, that's a great feeling. I'm proud of that feeling, you know, so, and that's really the thing. You know, you make a lot of money and you're successful financially and all of that kind of stuff. But that's not the instinct that drives it, at least it isn't with me. I remember when I was a boy, and my refugee father would take me with him sometimes to this little theater in Cleveland, the Lorraine Fulton Theater. And it was primarily a theater in an ethnic neighborhood for Europeans. And I was a little kid, I was 8 years old, and he was taking me to see things like Disick and Rossellini and The Bicycle Thief and all those wonderful European movies, Mongano, Wild Rice, and all of that stuff. I remember how much it meant to me and to him. Those are the first movies that I really saw. And not to put it on such a highfalutin level, I remember later on when I went to movies by myself in that same neighborhood, and I saw a movie called High School Confidential with the rocker Jerry Lee Lewis, right? And it was all rock and roll and sex and girls and smoking and all this happy shit. Man, it took me right out of my life. It was great, right? And that feeling, I got what that meant. Never mind when I saw Bardot for the first time, but that's a separate story. You know, so, and I remember what it meant, and I thought, when I write something, I think, if I can do that, and really this helps people, that's a great thing to do. When it's all over and done, and I'm not saying that it's all over and done at my age, but when it's all over and done, or at Andy's, but when it's all over and done, and you look back on what it is that you've done, I think that's a wonderful thing to focus on, that you've done that, you know.
Okay, question. Yes, so my question is two parts. So about Basic Instinct, you said that you had the idea for the ending. You knew exactly how you wanted it to end.
I didn't know exactly, but I had a rough idea.
What you really had to come up with is how to fill in the middle. The first part of my question is, does that happen to you often, or was that like very specific to Basic Instinct? And my second question is, how do you work through that? How do you, you know, how do you deal with knowing where to start, where to end, and you know, having to draw the line in between them?
It's a most difficult process. You don't really know. You know, your gut tells you, and I listen to mine a lot. I listen to my basic instincts a lot of my life. But there's no clear answer to that. You could be wrong. We're all human. We all make mistakes. I certainly made my share. But you trust your gut, you know. And when that particular script was done, and it was fleshed out, and it literally is one of the very few scripts that I've written where there's been no change made at all in the first draft. I felt that this really worked and it was really good. And it was made that way. But part of the reason for that, you know, that it was made that way is it was made by Carol, by Mario and Andy. It didn't have to go through a studio system. The studios would have brought in the experts and the focus groups who all would have bitched about the final scene and what does that ice pick mean, and you know, and some of Michael's issues, where's the redemption, and all of this stuff. So it got lucky because it was made by an entity that didn't have those usual concerns. But the very opposite could have happened. Could have wound up with a studio that never saw those things and said, no, we can't make this way. Michael would have made his argument about being one-upped every minute. The studio would have agreed with him because he's a big star, and studios have a tendency to do that. So the whole thing could have wound up in the gutter. Not in the gutter, but wound up certainly in the gutter for me creatively.
Well, I think part of that process, whoops. I think part of that process is also when you have to defend the script.
That's right.
I think when you go into one of those story meetings, and you get sometimes very stupid questions, sometimes you get great questions, and you know whether you can defend it or not. And if you can't defend it, then the idea is wrong. And you hear yourself talk about it. I know when I, as a producer, ask the questions, I want those defenses to be there for me, because I'm certainly isn't 100% sure that this is going to be a huge success, that it makes all the sense in the world. So I listen to you as the writer comment on my insecurity about that script. And that's a very important process, I think, for producers and for writers.
You also did that same defense for Smithy. Andy and I did this thing, an Alan Smithy film, Burn Hollywood Burn. It was a satire of Hollywood, a really hard-hitting one. And we cast it with Stallone and Whoopi Goldberg and Jackie Chan. And we were working with a studio that just didn't get this movie, right? And it was constant bombardment, both legally, and in every kind of way. And Andy did the best he could, and in terms of defending this. It was an entertainment that was way out there, that was very challenging, very unorthodox, and it was with Disney, and Disney didn't get what this piece was. I mean, it's crazy. I remember we had this blistering meeting with Disney and all of their executives, and I finally got really rude and horrible and bad behavior, as Naomi pointed out, because it was so frustrating. They just didn't get it. And I think most producers at that point would have abandoned the whole thing, and you didn't, so.
We have 11 Razzies to show for it.
Yes, we did.